The thunder came first, rolling down off the Chinati peaks like something enormous had been dropped from the sky, and then the herd broke. Stella Merritt felt it in the ground before she heard it, felt the earth shudder beneath the legs of the bay mare she rode, and she had one clear thought before the world dissolved into dust and bawling cattle and men shouting in two languages at once, 300 head, and every one of them running blind. "Get clear of the wagon," she shouted, though she doubted anyone could hear her over the roar. Lightning split the sky to the west, close enough that she felt the hair on her arms lift, and in that white flash she saw the herd wheel like a single animal and come pouring straight toward the camp where the chuck wagon sat with its fire still smoking from the noon meal. She swung the mare hard around, meaning to get between the herd and the wagon, a foolish and useless thing for one rider to attempt, but there was no time to think better of it. The rain had not even started yet. It was the smell of it, she thought later, the copper tang of a storm about to break, that had done it, that, and the crack of lightning striking an old cottonwood not 200 yards from where the remuda was picketed. A rope of horses screamed and tore their pickets loose and added their panic to the cattle's, and then it was chaos entire, cattle and horses running in every direction, men diving for what shelter there was, and Stella's mare, sensible animal that she was in ordinary weather, lost her head completely and bolted with the rest. She did not fight the mare. There was no fighting a horse in that state, not without getting thrown and trampled for her trouble. She gathered the reins short, leaned low over the mare's neck, and let the animal run, steering only enough to keep them angled away from the thickest of the stampede, praying there were no prairie dog holes or arroyo cuts in the ground ahead that neither of them could see. It was Clayton Prescott who found her, 20 minutes later and a mile and a half from where the camp had been, when the mare had finally run herself to a trembling stop in a stand of mesquite and Stella had slid down from the saddle with her legs shaking too hard to hold her. She heard the horse before she saw him, heard the particular quiet rhythm of a rider who was not fighting his mount but moving with it, and then he came out of the rain, sitting his grulla gelding as easily as if he were seated in a rocking chair on somebody's porch, his hat low against the rain that had finally begun to fall in earnest. "Miss Merritt." His voice was low, carrying without shouting, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime talking cattle and horses into calm. "You are not hurt." "I am not hurt." Her own voice came out steadier than she felt. "Are the others accounted for?" "Some, not all." He swung down from the gelding without hurry, though his eyes swept the tree line behind her, the ground, the sky, in the way of a man who never stopped reading his surroundings even in the middle of speaking. "Tomás has the chuck wagon. Ruiz went after the remuda. I do not know about Mr. Cobble." Cobble was her hired hand, an older man who had ridden for her father before her. Stella pressed her hand against her stomach, where the fear still sat coiled and sick. "We have to find them," she said. "We will." Clayton looked at the sky, at the black wall of cloud rolling in from the west, thicker now, and at the way the light had gone the strange green-gray color that any cattleman on that stretch of the Texas border knew to fear more than the lightning itself. "But not tonight and not in that. That is my herd, Mr. Prescott, my father's herd. And it will still be your herd tomorrow, ma'am, scattered from here to the river, and we will gather every head we can find. Tonight it is only a herd. If we ride into that storm looking for it, it will be a herd and two bodies, and I do not intend to be one of them, and I am not overly fond of the notion of you being the other." She might have argued further, except that the sky opened as if to punctuate his point. A sheet of rain and then hail mixed into it, hard little stones of ice that stung even through her hat and her sleeves, and the wind came behind it with a force that nearly took her off her feet. Clayton caught her elbow, steadying her without asking permission, and she let him because the alternative was falling, and there was a strange comfort in the solid grip of his hand even through the sting of the hail. "There is a rock shelf half a mile east," he said against the wind, his mouth close to her ear so she could hear him. "I have sheltered cattle there before. It will hold horses and it will hold us." "Lead on then," she said, and did not let herself think too hard about the fact that she, Stella Merritt, 26 years old and sole owner of 11,000 acres along Alameda Creek, was about to spend a night alone in a storm with her own foreman, a man she had hired 8 months before and had spent every one of those months trying very hard not to notice too closely. She noticed him closely now. There was no help for it. Riding behind him through rain that had turned the world to a gray roar, watching the easy, economical way he sat his horse even as the animal picked its way over ground gone treacherous and slick, watching the line of his shoulders under his soaked shirt, the calm competence of him that made her feel, for the first time since the herd had broken, that the night might end without disaster. The shelf, when they reached it, was a low overhang of pale limestone jutting from a hillside, deep enough to keep off the worst of the rain if they crowded close to the rock face, and Clayton had the horses picketed and unsaddled with the ease of long practice before Stella had finished wringing the water from her hat. "You have done this before," she said, watching him work. "More times than I care to count." He glanced at her, and in the gray light his teeth showed white for a moment, the first thing close to a smile she had seen from him all evening. Not always with such fine company. "Is that meant to be gallant, Mr. Prescott, or are you simply making conversation to keep from thinking about the herd?" "Perhaps both." He crouched at the edge of the overhang, studying the rain. "There is no shame in it if it is both." She sat down on a dry patch of stone with her back against the rock and pulled her wet coat tighter around her shoulders, and for a while neither of them spoke, listening to the hail rattle against stone and the distant bawling of cattle still running somewhere out in the dark. She was cold and she was frightened for her herd and for Cobble wherever he was, and yet some small, traitorous part of her mind kept circling back to the warmth of Clayton's hand on her elbow, the low steadiness of his voice, the fact that of all the men who might have found her in that storm, she was glad it had been him. "You are shivering," he said eventually. "It is a cold rain." "It is not so cold as that." He studied her a moment, and then, without asking, shrugged out of the dry underside of his own coat, the wool duster he had kept rolled behind his saddle and had thought to grab before it was lost to the stampede, and held it out to her. "Take it. I will not argue with you about it, so you may as well save your breath." She took it, because her pride was not so great as to refuse a dry coat in a hailstorm, and because there was something in the plain, unromantic practicality of the gesture that touched her more than any flowery speech could have. "Thank you," she said. "De nada." He settled himself a respectful distance away, close enough to share the shelter of the rock, far enough that there could be no mistaking his intentions as anything but honorable, and Stella found herself, absurdly, a little disappointed by the distance. "Tell me something, Mr. Prescott." She drew her knees up under the borrowed coat. "You have worked for me 8 months, and I know almost nothing about you beyond that you are the best hand with a horse I have ever hired and that my father would have liked you." Something shifted in his face, quick and shuddered, gone almost before she saw it. "There is not much to tell," he said. "I was born in Presidio del Norte, on the Mexican side, though my father was an American. He did not stay long enough to matter. I was raised mostly by my mother's family, learned horses from my uncle, who broke mounts for the army at Fort Davis for near 20 years. I have 3 sisters, 1 grown and married, 2 still at home. That is not nothing to tell. That is a family. It is not the whole of it." He looked out at the rain, and his jaw was tight in a way that made her curious, though something in his tone told her not to press. "But it is enough for tonight." She let it lie, though she marked it, the way he had closed a door partway through opening it, and told herself it was none of her business, even as some part of her decided quietly that she meant to learn what lay behind that door eventually. They spent the night in that shelter, dozing in fits between the worst of the storm's passes, and somewhere in the small hours Stella woke to find she had slid sideways in her sleep until her shoulder rested against Clayton's, and that he had not moved away, had in fact tucked his own coat, damp as it was, over her knees where the borrowed duster had slipped. She lay still for a long moment, listening to his breathing, steady and slow, and did not move either. By first light the storm had blown itself out, leaving the desert scoured clean and smelling of wet creosote, and they rode back toward the ranch to find Tomás and Ruiz already gathering what strays they could. An old cobble sitting on an overturned water barrel with a bruised shoulder, and his dignity considerably more wounded than his body, cursing the storm and the cattle and his own horse in about equal measure. They had lost 11 head to the stampede, 4 found dead in a ravine, and the rest simply scattered to the wind, and it took the better part of 4 days to gather what could be gathered. Stella worked alongside her hands from dawn until dark, and found herself, more often than not, aware of exactly where Clayton Prescott was in any given stretch of country, the particular whistle he used to call a horse back, the low murmur of Spanish he used to calm a spooked cow, the way he always seemed to know where she was riding before she said so, and positioned himself where he could reach her quickly if the ground turned bad. It was, she told herself firmly, only good sense in a foreman. It had nothing to do with the fact that she had begun, without quite meaning to, counting the days until she would see him again when he rode in from the far pastures each evening. The trouble, when it came, arrived not with thunder but with the mail rider from Fort Davis, and a letter addressed to Stella Merritt in a hand she recognized with a sinking heart as belonging to Horace Dunmore. Dunmore Cattle Company ran nearly 40,000 acres upstream of Merritt Land, a spread built by Horace Dunmore's father in the years after the war and expanded, by all accounts, through a mix of hard work and harder dealing, until it swallowed nearly every smaller outfit along the upper reaches of Alamito Creek. Every outfit, that was, except the Merritt place, which sat squarely across the only reliable stretch of Alamito Springs that had not already gone dry or brackish in the long drought years, and which held, moreover, an old land grant confirmed by the state of Texas that gave Stella's father, and now Stella, clear and undisputed right to that water. The letter was polite, as Dunmore's letters always were, full of careful phrases about neighborly cooperation and the good of the whole valley, and underneath the politeness it said, as it always said, that he wished to purchase her water rights, or failing that, to lease them, or failing that, he trusted she would understand that a woman alone could not be expected to manage such a valuable and contested resource indefinitely, and that he stood ready to assist her in whatever arrangement she found most convenient. Stella read it twice, standing in the yard with the dust of the gather still on her boots, and then folded it very precisely into quarters and put it in her apron pocket, because she had learned that tearing up Dunmore's letters only gave her the satisfaction of a moment's temper and none of the satisfaction of an answer. Bad news. Clayton had come up from the corral, leading his gelding, and something in her face must have told him plainly enough. The usual news. She managed a thin smile. Mr. Dunmore has once again discovered that he cannot abide the notion of a woman holding water he wants. He has asked before, every season since my father died. Each time the offer grows a little less polite underneath the politeness. She looked toward the springs, though they were too far to see from the yard, a green thread of cottonwoods marking their course down toward Paloma and the river beyond. My father held that water for 30 years without ever cutting off the village downstream. Dunmore would dam it in a season if he had the right, and Paloma would have nothing but what the rains leave in the tanks. You know this. I know Dunmore. She refolded her arms, feeling the letter crackle in her pocket. I have known him since I was a girl. He does not forgive being told no by anyone, and he likes it least of all from a woman. Clayton was quiet a moment, looking down the long slope of pasture toward the springs. My mother's people have farmed at Paloma for 3 generations, he said finally. Before that, it was a Kickapoo camp, and before that, a Mescalero one, going back longer than anyone troubles to remember. If the springs went dry, there would be nothing left to hold anyone there. I know it. She met his eyes. It is why I have never sold, whatever it has cost me, and why I do not intend to start now. Something in his expression, some quiet, steady respect, told her that he had needed to hear her say it, and she found herself glad she had said it plainly and without flinching, glad that whatever else lay unspoken between them, on this at least they stood on the same ground. It was 3 weeks after that letter that Stella first sat behind the telegraph key at Alameda Crossing, and it was not by any grand design that she had come to run the little relay office at all, but by the plain necessity of a widow's ledger that did not balance without some second income, and the fortunate accident that her father had insisted, years before, on teaching her the Morse code as a game between them on long winter evenings. Tapping out messages across the parlor with a rigged-up sounder he had built from a broken clock spring and a length of wire. The telegraph office at Alameda Crossing was a single room built onto the side of the mercantile, with a sounder and a key on a battered pine desk, and a line running north to Fort Davis, and from there, to the wider world of marshals and land offices and railroad schedules that most days felt very far removed from the dust and heat of the border settlement. Stella worked the key 3 afternoons and evenings a week, relaying messages for ranchers and merchants and the occasional army dispatch, and the $8 a month it brought in had, more than once, been the difference between a hard winter and an impossible one. She was at the key on a close, breathless evening in late July, with heat lightning flickering silently along the southern horizon, and the whole valley holding its breath for a storm that had not yet decided to break, when the line began to click with an incoming message routed through from Fort Davis, addressed to the deputy marshal at Presidio, and marked, in the sender's own preface from Horace Dunmore. She had not meant to read past the address. It was not her habit to linger over other men's business, whatever gossip it might have made for in a town as small as Alameda Crossing, and in the ordinary course of things she would have copied the message onto its form, sealed it, and sent it on by the morning rider without a second thought. But her hand stilled on the pencil somewhere in the second line, because the message did not concern water rights or cattle contracts, or any of the ordinary business that passed between Dunmore and the county offices. It concerned a man. "Have credible information," the message read, as she copied it letter by letter from the clatter of the key, "that Clayton Prescott, foreman Merritt Ranch, is same man known 1878 to 1880 as Clay Vega, wanted party in theft of horses from Bar T and anchor spreads near Fort Stockton, associate of Sela's Cane Gang. Request marshal investigate and issue warrant if confirmed. Will provide witness testimony if required." Stella's pencil stopped moving. The sounder clattered on, indifferent, finishing the message with a request for acknowledgement, and she sat very still in the close heat of the little office with the smell of coal oil and hot pine in her nose and her own heartbeat suddenly very loud in her ears. Clay Vega, Sela's Cane, horse theft, a warrant. She read the copied lines again, her hand shaking slightly now, and told herself, in the calm, reasonable voice she used for frightened horses and grieving neighbors, that there might be some mistake, that Dunmore was a man who would say a good deal to get what he wanted, that a name and a description proved nothing. But she knew, even as she told herself this, that it fit. It fit the shuttered look that had crossed Clayton's face the night in the rock shelter when she had asked him about his past. It fit the careful, closed way he spoke of the years before he had come to work the Merritt Range, always beginning his account somewhere in his early 20s, never before. It fit, God help her, the ease and speed with which he had once, months before, spotted a running iron hidden in a drifter's saddlebag, and known exactly what it meant, and exactly how a man might use one. A knowledge she had thought at the time was simply the wisdom of a good stockman, and now wondered if it went deeper than that. The sounder clicked again, insistent, awaiting her acknowledgement so the relay could close and the message could continue on toward Presidio by morning rider, and Stella Merritt sat with her hand hovering over the key and felt the whole weight of the choice settle onto her shoulders like a yoke. If she sent the acknowledgement, the message would go forward exactly as written, and within a week, perhaps less, there would be a warrant, and men riding out from Presidio or Fort Davis to arrest Clayton Prescott on a 6-year-old charge of horse theft, a charge that could see him hanged or sent to Huntsville for the better part of a decade, on the word of a man like Horace Dunmore, who had every reason in the world to want her foreman gone and her ranch weakened for it. If she did not send it, if she simply failed to acknowledge claimed line trouble, buried the message, and let the moment pass unremarked, she would be doing something no honest telegraph operator ought to do, tampering with another man's lawful business, and doing it for reasons that had far more to do with the way her chest tightened at the thought of Clayton Prescott in irons than with any clear notion of right and wrong. She sat with that choice for a long, long moment, while the lightning walked silently along the southern hills, and the heat pressed close and airless against the walls of the little office. And then she reached out, and instead of sending the acknowledgement, she reached over and opened the key's circuit, breaking the line clean, so that from Dunmore's end in Presidio, it would look for all the world like a storm had taken down the wire somewhere along its length. An unremarkable and entirely believable thing in that country in that season. Then she folded the copied message, the one no eyes but hers had yet seen, and put it inside her boot against her ankle, where it sat all the way home like a stone she had swallowed. She did not go to Clayton that night, though she wanted to, wanted with an intensity that frightened her to ride straight to the bunkhouse and demand the truth of him before her nerve failed. Instead, she lay awake in her own bed with the window open to the still, breathless dark, and told herself she needed to think, needed to be certain of her own mind before she put a question to him that could not be unasked. By morning she had decided two things, with the particular clarity that came sometimes after a sleepless night. The first was that she would not, could not, simply let the matter lie buried and unspoken, pretending she had seen nothing, because whatever else she was, Stella Merritt was not a woman who could love a man, if it came to that word, without knowing the truth of him first. The second was that, whatever the truth turned out to be, she owed him the chance to tell it in his own words, before she judged him by another man's telegram. She found him at the corral after the noon meal, working a new gray gelding on a long line, and she waited until the horse had settled into an easy, rhythmic circle before she spoke. Clayton. It was the first time she had used his given name to his face, and she saw him register it, saw his hand still slightly on the line. I need to speak with you. Alone, and it cannot wait. He looked at her a long moment, and something in her face must have told him this was no ordinary matter of ranch business, because he handed the gelding off to Tamaz without a word, and followed her to the shade of the cottonwoods by the spring house, where they would not be overheard. A telegraph came through the relay last night, she said when they had stopped, and she made herself look at him straight on. From Horace Dunmore, addressed to the deputy marshal at Presidio. It named a man called Clay Vega, wanted for horse theft off the Bar T and the Anchor, an associate of a man named Silas Kane, some 6 years back near Fort Stockton. She watched his face very closely as she spoke, and saw the color drain from beneath the brown of his skin, saw his jaw tighten, saw, most tellingly, that he did not ask her what any of it had to do with him. Dunmore says that man is you. The silence that followed seemed to stretch the whole length of the afternoon. A dove called somewhere in the cottonwoods, and the spring house dripped its slow, steady rhythm behind them, and Clayton Prescott stood with his hat in his hands and looked at the ground for a long moment before he lifted his eyes to hers. He is right, he said quietly. I was Clay Vega. For a little under 2 years I rode with Silas Kane. She had thought she was prepared to hear it. She found, hearing it plainly spoken, that she was not, and she felt something cold settle into her stomach even as some other part of her, the part that had lain awake all night arguing with itself, noted with something like relief that he had not tried to lie. Tell me, she said, all of it. I will not have half of a truth, Clayton. Not about this. He nodded slowly and told her. His father, Warren Prescott, had come down from the Noose's country in the years after the war chasing cheap grass and easy fortune, had married Rosa Vega in Presidio del Norte, and had stayed just long enough to father 3 children before the fortune failed to appear and he rode north again and did not come back, leaving Rosa to raise Clayton and his sisters on what work her family could find. Clayton had been 14 when his father left, old enough to feel the shame of it and too young to do much about the hunger that followed. His uncle had taught him horses, and horses had kept them fed for a while, breaking and gentling other men's stock for wages that never quite stretched far enough. He had been 19, hungry and proud and furious at a world that seemed determined to grind his mother down to nothing, when Silas Kane found him breaking a Mustang at a horse fair in Fort Stockton and offered him easy money for what Kane called simply moving stock across the border and back. It had taken Clayton 3 months to understand fully what he had gotten into, that the stock they moved was not their own, that Kane's operation ran horses stolen from Anglo ranches south into Mexico and sold them there, and Mexican-owned stock north again, a trade that touched both sides of the river and answered to neither. I told myself it was no worse than what the big outfits did to my mother's people every day, taking land that was never theirs to take, he said, his voice low and steady, though his hands, she noticed, were not quite steady at all. I told myself a great many things. I was young and I wanted money in my mother's hand more than I wanted a clean conscience, and for a while that was enough of an answer. What changed it? A man died. He said it flatly, without drama, the way a man speaks of a wound long healed but never forgotten. A boy, really, younger than I was, riding with us on a run near the Picos. A rancher's hired guns caught us moving stock we had no right to, and there was shooting, and Beteau did not get up again. He looked out toward the springs, his jaw tight. I rode away from Kane's outfit that same week and never went back. I sent my mother what money I had left and told her I had found honest work, and then I set out to make that true because I could not undo what I had done, but I could decide what I did next. And Kane, I heard now and again that he still ran a few men, mostly on the Mexican side these days, dealing in whatever stock could be moved and sold before questions caught up with it. I have not seen him in 6 years. I did not think anyone remembered Clay Vega at all. Someone did, Stella said quietly. Dunmore did. Dunmore has spies in every cantina between here and Fort Stockton, and money enough to loosen any tongue he needs loosened. Bitterness edged his voice for the first time. He does not want the marshal to hang me, Stella. He wants me gone from your ranch, and your ranch weakened without a foreman who can outride and outthink his own men, and he has found the cheapest way he knows to accomplish it. She studied him a long moment, this man who had just handed her, unasked, every weapon she might need to ruin him if she chose, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since the moment she had first read Dunmore's telegram. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked more gently now. "Because I was ashamed," he said simply. "Because you are the finest woman I have ever known, and the notion of you looking at me the way decent people looked at Clay Vega, back when Clay Vega still walked free in Fort Stockton, was more than I could bear to imagine." His eyes came up to hers, dark and unguarded in a way she had never seen them before. "I am not that man anymore, Stella. I have spent 6 years trying to be certain of that every single day. But I could not make you certain of it by telling you nothing, and I see that now." "No," she agreed. "You could not." She stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his eyes. "But you have told me now plainly and asked nothing of me for it." "That counts for a great deal with me, Clayton Prescott, more than you know. What will you do with the telegram?" "I already did something with it." She allowed herself, finally, the smallest smile. "I broke the line before I sent the acknowledgement. As far as Mr. Dunmore knows, a summer storm ate his message somewhere between here and Presidio, which is, I will note, an entirely believable thing to happen on that line in this season." He stared at her. "You tampered with the wire. For me." "I intercepted a message that would have ruined you," she said, "before I had any right at all to care whether you were ruined or not. I have spent the whole of last night and today asking myself why, and I find I already know the answer, even if I am not yet ready to say the whole of it aloud." She held his gaze steadily. But hear me plainly on this, Clayton. I broke that line once out of a feeling I did not yet trust. I will not do it again, not for you, not for anyone if it comes to outright dishonesty done for its own sake. If Dunmore sends another message, I cannot promise to bury it a second time. What I can promise is that I will fight beside you to see the truth told properly, on your terms and in your own words, before any lie of Dunmore's gets there first. That is more than I have any right to ask of you. You did not ask it. I am offering it. She reached out finally and took his hand, feeling the calluses of a lifetime with horses and rope against her palm. I told you once that I require honesty before I can offer trust to any man. You have given me that today at real cost to yourself. I will not throw it back at you now. He closed his hand around hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything more, standing in the shade of the cottonwoods with the spring house dripping behind them and the whole uncertain future of the valley stretched out ahead. And Stella thought, with a clarity that startled her, that whatever trouble Dunmore meant to bring down on them, she would rather face it standing beside this man than safely alone. The trouble did not wait long to arrive in the flesh. 10 days later, a stranger rode into a Lamedo crossing on a raw-boned buckskin, a lean, sun-weathered man in his 40s with pale eyes, and a way of watching a room that made the hair rise on the back of Stella's neck the first time she saw him, standing at the mercantile counter buying tobacco and asking, in an idle, unhurried voice, whether anyone hereabouts recalled a hand called Vega. She was in the telegraph office when Tomás came running to tell her, breathless, that a man was asking after Clayton by his old name, and she felt the blood drain from her face even as she made herself think clearly and quickly. Where is Clayton now? North pasture with the yearlings. Good. Keep him there if you can without telling him why, until I have had a chance to see this man for myself. She untied her apron, checked that the little pistol her father had given her sat where it belonged in her skirt pocket, and walked, outwardly calm, toward the mercantile. The stranger was leaning against the porch rail when she came out, turning a cigarette between his fingers, and he touched his hat brim to her with an ease that did not match the coldness in his pale eyes. Afternoon, ma'am. Would you happen to be the lady runs the telegraph office here? I would. Stella Merritt. She did not offer her hand. And you are Silas Kane. He said it plainly, without embarrassment, watching her face for a reaction, and she was proud afterward of how little she gave him. I understand you've a foreman out at your place, name of Prescott. Big man, good with horses, talks Spanish like he was born to it. I have several hands who fit that description in part, Mr. Kane. It is a common enough sort out here. I expect it is. His smile did not reach his eyes. I knew a man once, name of Vega, favored the same look, the same way with a Mustang. Lost track of him some years back, up around Fort Stockton way. I've a notion he might have found his way down this direction, taken up a new name to go with a new life. He drew on the cigarette. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, ma'am? I know a good deal about my own hands, Mr. Kane, and very little about strangers who ride into my town asking pointed questions about men who don't exist. She kept her voice level, pleasant even, the voice she used for difficult customers and stubborn mules. If you have business at a Lamedo crossing, the mercantile is well stocked and the hotel keeps a clean room. If your business is gossip about people who are none of your concern, I'll ask you to take it elsewhere. Something flickered behind the pale eyes, amusement or calculation, she could not tell which. You're a bold one for a telegraph girl. I am the owner of 11,000 acres and the only reliable water for 30 miles in 3 directions, Mr. Kane, and I have found that boldness serves me a good deal better than the alternative. She held his gaze. Good afternoon. She walked away before he could answer, her spine rigid and her heart hammering, and did not let herself run until she was well out of his sight. She found Clayton that evening, told him plainly of Kane's arrival and the questions he had asked, and watched the old shadow of fear cross his face before he mastered it. He is here for Dunmore, Clayton said grimly. When the telegram never reached the marshal, Dunmore sent his own man to finish the errand in person. Kane will not need a warrant if he means only to spread the story loud enough in the right ears, or worse, if he means to force my hand some other way. Force your hand how? Kane never did anything for simple spite. If he is here, he means to use what he knows, not merely to expose it. Clayton's jaw was tight. He will come to me before the week is out, and he will want something in exchange for his silence. That is how he has always worked. He was right. Kane found Clayton alone 2 evenings later, at the corral after dark, and Stella, coming out to the spring house for water and hearing low voices carried on the still night air, crept close enough through the mesquite to hear the shape of it, though not every word. "Easy enough," Kane was saying, in that same unhurried voice. "A word in the right ear from me, or a word in the right ear from you. All I want is for the Merritt woman's water claim to look a good deal less certain than it does now. A paper gone missing from the land office file, say. You know which paper, you've seen her records. I will not do it." Clayton's voice was flat and hard, a tone Stella had never heard from him before. "Whatever you and Dunmore threaten, I will not put my hand to hurting her. Then I reckon Deputy Marshal Ruggles at Presidio is going to hear an interesting story about a horse thief called Vega, aren't he?" Kane's voice had gone soft and ugly. "Man like that, working close to a fine young widow's fortune, all alone out here. Folks will wonder what else he's been up to, once they know the one thing." "Tell your story, then, and see how far it carries you." Clayton's voice did not waver. "I have spent 6 years building an honest name in this valley, Kane. Ask anyone from here to Fort Davis what kind of man Clayton Prescott is. Your word against a life lived plain in front of witnesses is a poor wager, even for a gambling man like you." Kane laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "We'll see how plain that life looks once the marshal starts asking around Fort Stockton way. I expect there's still a rancher or two who'd be right glad to swear out a complaint, 6 years or no." He stepped back, and Stella, crouched in the mesquite, saw him mount his buckskin with unhurried ease. "You've got a week, Vega, to think on my offer. After that, I stop asking nice." He rode off into the dark, and Clayton stood alone at the corral rail for a long moment before Stella came out from her hiding place, unable to keep silent any longer. "I heard," she said before he could ask. "Enough of it, at least. Then you know he means to force my hand against you or ruin me trying." "I know he thinks he can." She came to stand beside him at the rail. "Clayton, listen to me. Kane's whole scheme depends on fear, yours and mine both. He wants you frightened enough to sabotage my claim, and he wants me frightened enough, once the story comes out, to send you away rather than be tainted by association with a wanted man. If neither of us is frightened, if we stand together in this rather than apart, what can he actually do? He can go to the marshal. There may yet be a warrant in it, whatever the years that have passed. Then let us go to the marshal first, on our own terms, before Kane or Dunmore ever gets there." She turned to face him fully. "You told me the truth about Bateau, about Kane, about every part of it, when you had every reason to keep silent. Tell that same truth to Marshal Coyle at Fort Davis, plainly and first, before Dunmore's version of it ever reaches his ears. A man who comes forward himself looks very different to a lawman than a man dragged in by another man's accusation." Clayton was quiet a long moment, turning the idea over. "It is a considerable risk." So is waiting for Kane to strike first. She reached out and took his hand, the same as she had beneath the cottonwoods. "I would rather face a risk of my own choosing beside you than sit waiting for one of Dunmore's making to fall on us both." He looked down at their joined hands, and something in his face eased, some tension she had not fully realized he carried until she saw it lift. "You are a remarkable woman, Stella Merritt." "I am a practical one," she said, though she felt the warmth of the words all the way to her toes. "Practical women do not wait to be ruined. They act first." They rode for Fort Davis 3 days later, a hard 55 miles across country that Clayton knew better than any map, planning to reach Marshal Coyle before Kane's patience ran out and before Dunmore could send any further mischief down the wire. They left before dawn, taking the shorter mountain trail through Wild Rose Pass rather than the longer stage road. And it was on the second day, with the fort still a good 20 miles off, that the sky to the south began to build the towering black anvil clouds that meant, in that country in that season, serious trouble coming. They had nearly reached the fort when the storm caught them in earnest, and what had begun as an ordinary summer thunderhead built with terrifying speed into something far worse, hail hammering down the size of gravel, and then the size of eggs, lightning striking so close and so continuous that the air itself seemed to crackle, and behind it all a wind that flattened the grass and turned the whole world the color of an old bruise. It was in the middle of that storm, fording a normally dry arroyo that had, in the space of 20 minutes, become a churning brown flood 4 feet deep and rising, that Stella's mare lost her footing on the slick rock bottom and went down, pitching Stella into the current. The water took her fast, colder than she expected, full of debris and the terrible dragging pull of a flash flood, and she had one clear thought, that she must not panic, must find the surface, must keep her boots pointed downstream to fend off rocks, before the current spun her hard against something solid and drove the breath from her lungs. Then a rope hit the water beside her, and Clayton's voice, roaring over the storm, "Take hold! Stella, take hold of it now!" She got both hands on the rope, more by instinct than conscious thought, and felt it go taut as he took the strain from horseback on the bank, his gelding braced and straining. And slowly, agonizingly, she felt herself dragged sideways out of the main force of the current toward the bank, until her knees found purchase on submerged rock, and she could crawl the last few feet onto solid ground, coughing up muddy water and shaking so hard she could barely stand. Clayton was off his horse and at her side in an instant, his hands running over her arms and shoulders with a rough urgency that had nothing to do with propriety. "Are you hurt? Stella, look at me, are you hurt?" "I am well," she managed between coughs. "Only wet and half drowned. My mare made it across on her own. Look, she is shaking herself off yonder." He pulled her into his arms then without asking, and she let him, pressing her face against his soaked shirt and feeling his heart hammering as hard as her own. "I thought the current had you. I thought—" He did not finish the sentence, only held her tighter. "You caught me," she said into his chest. "I never doubted you would." They found a shallow cave in the rock face a quarter-mile on, barely more than an overhang but enough to break the worst of the wind, and there was nothing for it but to wait out the storm, both of them soaked through and Stella shivering hard enough that her teeth chattered. Clayton built no fire. There was nothing dry enough to burn, but he pulled her close against him, sharing what warmth their two bodies could make between them, and for a long while they simply sat like that, listening to the storm rage outside and the arroyo roar with floodwater. And Stella found that she was not afraid, not truly, not with his arm around her and his cheek resting against the top of her head. "I have been trying," he said quietly into the dark, "for some time now to find the courage to tell you something." "Tell me now," she said. "I think we have earned a little honesty tonight of all nights." "I love you, Stella Merritt." He said it simply, without flourish, the same way he had confessed his past to her beneath the cottonwoods. "I have loved you, I think, since the first stampede, since I found you sitting your horse in that storm as calm and capable as any man I have ever ridden with, and every day since has only deepened it. I did not mean to tell you here, soaked through in a flood, but I find I cannot hold it back any longer." Stella turned her face up to his, and in the dim gray light filtering through the rain she could see every plane of his face, the strong jaw, the dark steady eyes, the mouth that so rarely smiled but which, when it did, undid her completely. "I love you too," she said, and felt the words settle something in her chest that had been unsettled since the first night in the rock shelter. "I have fought it, because I told myself I could not afford to love a man I did not fully know, and then you gave me the whole truth of yourself when it would have been easier to hide it, and I found there was nothing left to fight." He kissed her then, gently at first and then with more certainty, and Stella kissed him back with the whole of the fear and relief and love that had been building in her for weeks, and when at last they drew apart she rested her forehead against his and laughed, a shaky, joyful sound. "We are still soaked through and stranded in a flood," she said, "and I have never in my life felt so happy." "Nor I," he said, and kissed her again. The storm broke by morning, and they reached Fort Davis by midday, travel-worn and mud-stained but resolved, and found Marshal Coyle, a heavy-set, weathered man with a reputation for fairness, willing to hear them out in his cramped office beside the parade ground. Clayton told the whole of it plainly, exactly as he had told Stella, the poverty, the desperation, the 2 years riding with Kane, Bateau's death, the 6 years since spent building an honest life. Coyle listened without interruption, his face giving away little, and when Clayton had finished, he was quiet a long moment, tapping his pencil against the desk. "There was never a formal charge filed against a man called Vega," he said finally. "I checked the old dockets myself, some years back, on account of Kane's outfit causing trouble clear across 3 counties. Suspicion, yes. Testimony from ranch hands who half the time couldn't tell one Mexican vaquero from another in a dust-up at night. But no sworn complaint, no formal warrant ever issued, not against you by either name." He looked up at Clayton. "Silas Kane, on the other hand, has a warrant outstanding in Pecos County going back 4 years, for a stage robbery near Toya. I'd be a good deal more interested in bringing him in than in chasing after a man who walked away from that life and made something honest of himself since." Then Dunmore's telegram was a fool's errand built on nothing but an old man's spite and a woman's fear, Coyle said, not unkindly. "I'll not deny Dunmore could have caused you a good deal of trouble and expense before it all sorted out, Mr. Prescott, but there was no warrant coming from this office on the strength of what he sent, formal complaint or no. A man walking in ahead of the story, telling the truth plain like you just did, that carries a good deal more weight with me than a rancher's telegram ever could." Relief hit Stella so hard her knees went briefly weak, and she reached for Clayton's hand without thinking, and saw Coyle's eyes note the gesture and soften slightly. "I'll send word to the marshal's office at Pecos about Kane's whereabouts," Coyle went on. "If he's fool enough to still be riding this territory when word gets around, we'll have him. As for Dunmore, sending a telegram accusing a man of a crime with no evidence but hearsay is a good way to find himself facing a slander suit if either of you cared to pursue it." "We do not want a lawsuit, Marshal," Stella said. "We want to be left in peace to run our land and raise our horses. If you would simply make plain, should Dunmore try this again, that there is nothing to it, that will be justice enough for us." Coyle nodded slowly. "That I can do, and gladly." He extended his hand to Clayton, an unusual courtesy from a lawman to a man who had just confessed a criminal past, and Clayton took it. "Go on home, Mr. Prescott. Sounds to me like the valley needs you a good deal more than the law does." They rode home lighter than they had ridden out, the immediate threat of the law lifted from Clayton's shoulders like a physical weight, though both of them knew Dunmore and Kane were unlikely to accept defeat so quietly, and the deeper trouble, the trouble of the springs and the water, remained entirely unresolved. It came to a head faster and worse than either of them expected. They returned to find Ruiz waiting anxiously at the ranch gate with news that Dunmore's men had, in their absence, begun building something upstream at the springs themselves. A rough earthen and timber dam meant, so far as anyone could tell, to divert the flow entirely onto Dunmore land and starve both the Merritt Range and the village of Paloma below it. "He means to force the matter before any lawyer or marshal can settle it properly," Clayton said grimly, surveying the half-finished structure from a ridge above the springs the next morning, Stella beside him on her mare. "If that dam holds through the next real flood, it could reroute the whole channel permanently. Once the water finds a new bed, it does not go back to the old one easily. Then we stop it before the next flood," Stella said. "Whatever it takes." They rode into Paloma that same afternoon, and found the village already gathering in worried knots along the dusty central square. The old adobe chapel and the scattered farmhouses and the withering fields of beans and corn that depended entirely on the springs for irrigation in a summer that had otherwise brought little rain worth speaking of. Rosa Prescott came out to meet them, a small, straight-backed woman with Clayton's same steady dark eyes, and embraced her son fiercely before turning her attention to Stella. "You are the Merritt girl," she said, studying Stella with frank appraisal. "My son speaks of you more than he thinks I notice." "Mama," Clayton said, coloring slightly, and Stella found herself smiling despite the gravity of the moment. "I'm glad to meet you at last, Senora Prescott," she said. "I only wish the circumstances were kinder." "Circumstances are rarely kind to people like us," Rosa said, not bitterly but simply as a statement of long experience. "Come." Everyone is frightened, and frightened people need to see that someone is doing something, not merely talking of it. They gathered the village elders, along with Tomás and Ruiz and old Cobble from the Merritt outfit, in the shade of the chapel wall, and laid out what they knew. Dunmore's dam, if completed, and if it held through even one serious flash flood, threatened to permanently reroute Alameda Creek away from both the Merritt Range and Paloma's fields, concentrating the whole flow onto Dunmore's own upstream pastures. It was, by any honest reading of the old land grant, flatly illegal, an act of theft dressed up as improvement, but proving it in any court would take months, months that Paloma's crops and Merritt's herds did not have. "The dam is not yet finished," Clayton said. "2 more days of work, perhaps 3, and it will be strong enough to hold against ordinary flow. But this is flood season. If a real storm comes before then, hitting it while it is still green and unfinished, it may not hold at all." "You mean to let the storm do our work for us," said one of the elders, an old man named Anselmo who had farmed at Paloma since before Clayton was born. "I mean that we do not need to fight Dunmore's men with rifles to win this," Stella said. "We need only delay them, and let the country do what the country will do in its own season. If we can slow the work even a little, force them to rebuild what the flood takes down, the growing season will end and Dunmore will have spent a great deal of money and effort proving nothing but his own greed to anyone who cares to look. And how do we slow armed men building on land they claim is theirs?" Anselmo asked. Clayton and Stella exchanged a look, and it was Clayton who answered. "We do not fight them. We outlast them, and we make certain every soul from here to Fort Davis knows exactly what is being built and why, before Dunmore can dress it up as anything but theft." He looked around the circle of worried faces. "Tomás, Ruiz, I need riders who know this country to watch that dam day and night, and send word the moment weather builds. Senora Merritt has a telegraph key. If we can get word to the land commissioner's office at Austin before the dam is finished, showing them the survey markers and the old grant boundary, they may act faster than any of us expect, simply to avoid the scandal of an illegal diversion on record land." It took 2 days of careful, quiet work, riders watching the dam from a discreet distance, Stella sending a careful, factual telegram to the state land office describing the illegal construction and citing the exact grant language her father had kept filed for 30 years. And on the evening of the second day, the sky to the southwest began, once again, to build the black, towering thunderheads that meant serious trouble. Stella watched the clouds build from the ranch house porch with a strange, tight feeling in her chest, torn between hoping the storm would do exactly the destructive work they needed and dreading, given what such a storm might mean for the low ground around Paloma, what else it might destroy along the way. It was near midnight, with the first hard rain already lashing the ranch house windows, when Tomás came pounding up to the porch, soaked through, his horse blown hard. "The dam is going," he gasped. "It is going now, and Paloma's low fields are already taking water. And Miss Rosa says the fever has come to 3 of the children, the Ibarra boy worst of all. She says they need the doctor's medicine, the fever medicine, quinine, and the calomel, but the ford at Alamito is already too high to cross, and the fever will not wait for the water to fall. Clayton was already moving, pulling on his boots and coat. How bad is the fever? Bad. Senora Rosa says by tomorrow night, if it is what she thinks, it could take the youngest ones. Stella felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, remembering suddenly, and with terrible clarity, the stagnant, standing pools that Dunmore's partial dam had already created upstream over the past weeks. The kind of foul water that bred exactly the sort of summer fever that killed children in this country every year. And understanding in one sick rush that Dunmore's greed had very likely poisoned the very water that gave Paloma life. Fort Davis has the medicine, she said. Dr. Whitfield keeps a full chest at the post hospital. 55 miles in this. Clayton was already checking his saddlebags, his face set and grim. In good weather, a hard day's ride. In this, he did not finish, but she saw him doing the calculation anyway, storm against distance against a sick child's fading hours. Then we do not wait for good weather, Stella said, and found her own boots and coat already in her hands. I am coming with you. Stella, this storm is exactly the kind of storm I have ridden through my whole life. On land I know as well as you know your own hands, Clayton Prescott. And you will not talk me into staying behind while a child dies for want of a rider who knows the shortcuts through Wild Rose Pass better than any man at Fort Davis. She met his eyes, unflinching. We go together or you go alone and slower, and either way we are wasting minutes we do not have. He looked at her for one long moment, weighing the argument, and then nodded once sharply. Together, then. God help us both. They rode out within the quarter hour, into a night gone entirely black except for the intermittent, blinding flare of lightning, rain coming in sheets so thick it was, at times, difficult to breathe, and hail rattling down hard enough to bruise where it struck bare skin. The familiar landscape of the daylight hours vanished entirely, reduced to brief, strobing glimpses caught in each lightning flash. A rock formation here, the pale gleam of a flooded arroyo there, gone again before the eye could fully register it. Clayton led, trusting instinct and long memory over sight, following a trail through Wild Rose Pass that Stella could barely make out even when the lightning showed it plain, and more than once they were forced to dismount and lead the horses on foot across ground too treacherous to ride, feeling their way forward with hands and boots when eyes were useless. How do you know where we are? Stella shouted at one point when the rain had briefly slackened enough to allow speech. I do not entirely, he shouted back, with what might, in gentler circumstances, have been a laugh. I know where the pass generally lies, and I trust the horses to tell me the rest. Grulla here has crossed this ground more times than either of us. They lost nearly an hour skirting a flash flood that had turned a normally dry wash into a roaring brown torrent 20 feet across, forced to backtrack and find higher ground. And Stella felt the minutes bleeding away with a physical ache, thinking of a child's fever climbing in the dark while they fought yard by yard through a storm that seemed determined to swallow them whole. It was near 4 in the morning, both of them soaked to the bone and shaking with cold despite the summer heat, when the dark bulk of Fort Davis finally resolved out of the driving rain, lantern light glowing faint and impossible in a window of the post hospital, and Stella nearly wept with relief at the sight of it. Dr. Whitfield, roused from sleep and startled at the sight of 2 mud-caked, half-drowned riders on his doorstep in the middle of the night, listened to their story with quick, professional attention, and had his medicine chest packed within minutes, quinine and calomel and clean bandaging, and a careful written instruction for dosing children, along with a jar of carbolic acid to treat the water itself if it came to that. You cannot ride back through this in the dark, he said, eyeing the storm still raging outside. You will kill yourselves and lose the medicine besides. We will wait for first light, Clayton said, but not a minute longer than that. There's a boy at Paloma who may not have until noon. They waited out the last of the storm's worst violence in the warmth of the post hospital, wrapped in borrowed army blankets, and Stella found herself, despite the exhaustion and the fear still gnawing at her, deeply, quietly grateful for the man beside her, who had ridden into a killing storm without a single word of complaint because a child he had likely never met was dying of a fever caused by another man's greed. They rode out at the first gray hint of dawn, the storm reduced now to a steady, ordinary rain, and made the return journey in a little over 6 hours, pushing the horses as hard as they dared, retracing their path through Wild Rose Pass with the daylight at least allowing them to see the worst of the flood damage and route around it with something better than blind instinct. They reached Paloma to find the fields drowned under standing floodwater from the collapsed dam upstream, exactly as they had hoped and dreaded in equal measure, Dunmore's illegal construction torn apart by the very flood they had waited for. But the village itself, thank God, spared, built as it was on slightly higher ground that had weathered generations of just such storms. Rosa met them at the door of the small house where the sick children had been gathered, her face drawn with exhaustion but her eyes lighting at the sight of the medicine chest. "You came," she said simply, taking Clayton's face in her hands for a brief moment before turning to the work at hand. "The Ibarra boy is very bad. Come, quickly." The next several hours passed in a blur of careful dosing and cool cloths, and Dr. Whitfield's written instructions followed to the letter, and by evening the worst of the fever in the youngest Ibarra child had broken, and the other 2 sick children, caught earlier in the illness, were already improving. Stella sat outside the small house afterward, bone-tired and filthy and happier than she could remember being in years, and watched Clayton emerge to sit beside her on the low adobe wall, equally exhausted, equally relieved. "They will live," he said quietly. "All 3 of them. Whitfield's medicine came in time." "Because you knew every foot of that pass in the dark," she said, "and because you did not once hesitate to ride into that storm for people who are not even blood kin to Paloma by your reckoning, only neighbors. They are my mother's people. That makes them mine, blood or no." He looked at her, something soft and wondering in his tired face. "And you rode beside me the whole way, Stella, when you might have stayed safe and dry and simply sent me alone. I will not forget that." "I did not consider staying behind an option worth entertaining," she said, and leaned her head against his shoulder, too tired for pretense. "I love you, Clayton. I meant it in that cave during the flood, and I mean it doubly now, having watched you ride through hell itself for people you love." He kissed the top of her head gently. "And I love you more than I have words for tonight, though I promise to find better ones once I have slept for a week." The dam's collapse, and the flooding of Dunmore's own lower pastures that resulted from the sudden, uncontrolled release of the water it had briefly held back, proved a costlier disaster for Dunmore Cattle Company than any lawsuit could have managed, drowning a considerable stretch of his own hay fields and several dozen head of cattle caught low in the wash when the flood hit. Word of the illegal dam, its collapse, and the fever it had caused in Paloma spread through the valley within days, carried by outraged ranchers and merchants who had no love for Dunmore's high-handed ways, even when they had no particular fondness for a woman running her own spread either. The Land Commissioner's office in Austin, prompted by Stella's telegram, and now facing a scandal that had already cost a village a near tragedy in sick children, sent an investigator within the month, and the finding, when it came, was unambiguous. Dunmore had knowingly built beyond his own boundary, in flat violation of the grant recognized by the state since before Texas independence, and faced not only an order to remove all remaining works from the springs, but a substantial fine besides. Silas Kane, meanwhile, had vanished from the valley entirely within a week of the marshal's inquiries reaching Pecos County, and word reached Alameda Crossing some 2 months later that he had been arrested near Toya on the old stage robbery warrant, ending, so far as anyone in the valley cared to know, any further threat from that quarter. Horace Dunmore, humiliated and considerably poorer, made no further attempt to claim the springs, and though he remained a neighbor of a sort for years afterward, he troubled the Merritt Ranch and the village of Paloma no more. having learned, at considerable cost, that Stella Merritt was not a woman to be moved by threats, letters, or floods alike. It was a bright, clear morning in early autumn, the summer storms finally spent and the valley washed clean and green in their aftermath, when Clayton found Stella at the telegraph office, finishing her afternoon relay of messages, and waited with unusual patience until she had closed the key and turned to him. "I have something to ask you," he said, and there was a seriousness in his face that made her set aside the ledger she had been reaching for. "Ask, then." "I have spent this last month building a small house on the rise above the springs," he said, "on land your father's grant included but never used, with your permission granted some weeks back, though you may not have understood at the time exactly what I meant to build there." "I recall giving my permission," she said, smiling slightly, "and wondering at the time what exactly my foreman needed with a house of his own when the bunkhouse suited him well enough. It is not meant only for me." He took a small velvet box from his coat pocket, worn soft with handling, and Stella felt her breath catch. "Stella Merritt, I have loved you since a stampede first threw us together in a storm, and every trial we have weathered since has only deepened that love beyond anything I believed myself capable of feeling. I am asking you to marry me, to share that house above the springs, and to let me spend the whole of my life proving myself worthy of the trust you gave me before I had any right to ask for it." Stella looked at the small ring in the box, simple silver work, likely made by a Presidio smith, and then at the man holding it out to her, this vaquero who had ridden through a killing storm for a child not his own, who had confessed his worst shame to her rather than let her love him under false pretenses, who had caught her from a flood and never once, in all the months since, made her feel less than fully capable simply because she was a woman running her own land. "Yes," she said, and found she was laughing and crying both at once. "Yes, Clayton Prescott, I will marry you, on the condition that you understand plainly, now and for the whole of our life together, that I do not intend to stop running this ranch or working this telegraph key simply because I have taken a husband. I would not dream of asking you to," he said, sliding the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly despite their usual steadiness. "I have watched you manage this land better than any man in the valley these 2 years past, Stella. I am not fool enough to want that woman changed into someone smaller, someone easier for my own comfort. I want the whole of you, exactly as you are." "And I want the whole of you," she said, "vaquero and horse breaker and honest man all together, without a single part of your past hidden away out of shame ever again." They were married in November, in the little chapel at Paloma, with Rosa Prescott weeping happy tears in the front row and half the valley in attendance, Anglo ranch hands and Mexican farmers, and even old Cobble, cleaned up and solemn in a borrowed coat, standing shoulder to shoulder in a way that would have seemed unlikely to any of them a year before. Stella kept the telegraph office, running the key 3 afternoons a week just as she always had, and kept the Merritt name on the ranch's deed and brand both, a point of pride she and Clayton had discussed plainly and settled without rancor before ever standing at the altar. Clayton, for his part, began breeding horses in earnest on the rise above the springs, his reputation for gentling the wildest mustangs into willing partners spreading, within a few years, well beyond the valley's borders, so that ranchers from as far as El Paso sent their worst-tempered stock to him for schooling. The springs themselves ran clear and full through every season after, shared by long custom and clear law between the Merritt Range and the fields of Paloma, and it became, in time, simply understood along that stretch of the border that the water belonged to all who had always depended on it, and to none who sought only to hoard it for themselves. On summer evenings, when the thunderheads built once more along the southern horizon, Stella and Clayton would often sit together on the porch of their house above the springs, watching the lightning walk the distant hills, no longer with fear but with the easy familiarity of two people who had weathered far worse together and found, on the other side of every storm, only more reason to love each other. "Do you ever regret it?" She asked him once, years into their marriage, watching him mend a length of harness by lamplight. Telling me the truth that day beneath the cottonwoods, it would have been easier to keep silent, and perhaps I never would have known. I regret only that I waited as long as I did. He set down the harness and reached for her hand, the same steady grip that had once pulled her from a flood. You required honesty of me before you would offer trust, and it was the hardest and best thing anyone has ever asked of me. I have never once regretted becoming a man worthy of both. She leaned into him, watching the lightning flash silent and distant over land that was, at last and for good, entirely at peace, and thought that whatever storms the future still held, she would face every one of them exactly as she had faced the first, with this man's hand in hers and no secrets left unspoken between them.